Welcome to Alcott Stories channel. Hello, beautiful souls. We're so glad you're here with us today. Get ready to embark on a journey of emotions, adventure, and unforgettable love stories. Whether you're here for a steamy romance, a heartwarming tale, or a thrilling twist, Alcott Stories has something special just for you. We believe in stories that move the heart, ignite the imagination, and leave a lasting impression. So sit back, relax, and let yourself get lost in the world of passion, drama, and true love. We're here to make your day a little brighter, your heart a little warmer, and your world a little more magical. So let's dive into the story, and don't forget, you're never alone here. Make sure to subscribe to Alcott Stories channel for more captivating tales of love, passion, and unforgettable journeys. And if you're ready to be a part of our Alcott family, hit that like button, share the love with your friends, and leave a comment below letting us know what you want to hear next. Don't miss out on the adventure. Your next favorite story is just a click away. Thank you for choosing Alcott Stories. Let's get lost in this adventure together. The evening shimmered with wealth and extravagance. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel in New York was lit with golden chandeliers, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and whispered conversations among the elite. The city's most powerful businessmen and glamorous socialites had gathered for a charity gala, but none of it mattered to Elia Carter. She was there for one reason: to work. Wearing a simple yet elegant black dress, her curly dark brown hair cascading down her shoulders, Elia stood behind the long glass-covered bar, mixing drinks with an effortless grace. Her skin glowed like polished bronze under the soft lighting, her hazel eyes captivating yet distant as she focused on the task at hand. This wasn't her world. She didn't belong among the diamonds and designer dresses, but she had learned to navigate through it, using her sharp wit and fierce independence as armor. Then he walked in. The moment Damian Knight stepped into the ballroom, a hush fell over the crowd. Standing at 6 feet 3 inches, broad-shouldered and exuding power with every step, Damian was the kind of man who commanded attention effortlessly. His jet-black tuxedo fit him like a second skin, tailored to perfection. His midnight blue eyes were sharp, calculating, eyes that had built an empire, that had crushed competition without hesitation. Women in designer gowns turned their heads, their eyes filled with desire. Men nodded in respect, whispering about his latest billion-dollar acquisitions. But Damian barely noticed any of them. His eyes had found her. Elia wasn't like the others in the room. She wasn't dripping in diamonds or forcing a fake smile to impress him. She was effortlessly beautiful, her brown skin glowing under the golden light, her full lips pursed in concentration as she poured a drink. There was something in the way she moved, graceful yet unbothered, confident yet mysterious. Damian was intrigued, and that was dangerous, because Damian didn't do intrigued. Elia felt his gaze before she saw him. A shiver ran down her spine, a strange heat settling in her stomach. When she finally looked up, her breath caught. God, he's gorgeous. His chiseled jawline, perfectly sculpted cheekbones, and those piercing blue eyes. It was almost unfair for one man to look that good. But it wasn't just his looks. It was the way he carried himself, like he owned the world and didn't care if people knew it. Elia raised an eyebrow, composing herself. "What can I get you?" Damian smirked, resting his elbows on the bar. His voice was deep, rich, with a hint of amusement. "Surprise me," Elia scoffed, shaking her head. "That's what people say when they have no idea what they want." Damian chuckled, genuinely entertained. He couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him like that, without fear, without pretense. "I always know what I want," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips for a brief second before meeting her eyes again. "I just enjoy the thrill of being surprised." For a moment, the world around them faded. The music, the chatter, the flashing cameras. It all blurred into nothing. It was just them, a dangerous pull, a fire that neither of them saw coming. Alaya kept her composure, though her heart was racing. "Fine," she said, turning around to grab a few bottles. "Let's see if you can handle my kind of surprise." With expert precision, she mixed a custom cocktail, adding a little flourish as she slid it toward him. Damien took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. The drink was strong, smooth, with a hint of unexpected sweetness. "Impressive," he admitted. Alaya smirked. "I know." The way she said it, so bold, so unapologetic, made something deep inside Damien tighten. Damien leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "So, what's a woman like you doing behind a bar at a place like this?" Alaya shrugged. "Making a living." He tilted his head. "Something tells me you don't belong here." She crossed her arms, leaning on the counter. "And where exactly do I belong, Mr. Knight?" Damien's gaze darkened, filled with something unreadable. "Somewhere you can't be bought. Somewhere where people don't just see a beautiful face, but a fire they can't tame." Alaya's breath hitched. He saw her. Really saw her. And that terrified her. Before she could respond, another guest interrupted, dragging Damien's attention away. Alaya exhaled, forcing herself to breathe. What the hell just happened? But the night wasn't over yet, because hours later, when the gala was wrapping up, Damien found her again. This time, he didn't just talk. He made an offer. "One night," he murmured, his fingertips lightly tracing the back of her hand. "No strings. No expectations." Alaya knew she should say no. Damien Knight was the kind of man who left destruction in his wake. But the way he looked at her, like he was starving for her, made her pulse skyrocket. For the first time in her life, she wanted to break her own rules. And before she could think twice, she whispered the words that would change everything. "Okay." The air between them was charged, thick with an unspoken desire neither of them wanted to name. Damien Knight had never been the kind of man to chase, but Alaya Carter was unlike anyone he had ever met. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth or power. She wasn't playing a game to impress him. She was simply herself. And that was the most intoxicating thing of all. The gala had long since ended, but Damien wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. He leaned against the bar, watching as Alaya effortlessly mixed another drink for a lingering guest. The way she moved, the confidence in her every gesture, had his chest tightening in a way that made no sense. What was it about her? Alaya could feel his gaze on her. It was like heat licking at her skin, making her pulse race. She had served thousands of men before, some rich, some powerful, some charming, but none of them had made her feel like this, like she was walking a tightrope above a raging fire. When she finally turned to him, her hazel eyes glimmered with curiosity and something dangerously close to temptation. "Still here, Mr. Knight?" He smirked, taking a slow sip of his drink. "I don't leave until I get what I want." Alaya raised an eyebrow, folding her arms. "And what exactly do you want?" His eyes darkened, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "You." The word hung in the air between them, stealing her breath. Alaya swallowed, forcing herself to stay composed. This was a game she knew men like him played. "One night," he continued, his fingers lightly tracing the rim of his glass. "No strings, no expectations." Alaya's heart pounded. She should have laughed in his face. She should have walked away. But she didn't. Because there was something about the way he looked at her, like she was the only woman in the world, that made it impossible to say no. Her voice was softer than she intended when she finally whispered, "Why me?" Damien tilted his head, studying her as if trying to figure her out. Because you're not like the rest of them. It was a simple answer, yet it made her stomach flip. She should say no. She wasn't the kind of woman who fell for empty promises. She wasn't reckless, but tonight, she wanted to be reckless. Without another word, she reached for his glass, took a slow sip of his drink and set it down. Then she leaned in, her lips a whisper away from his. "One night," she murmured. "That's all." Something dangerous flickered in Damien's eyes. He didn't hesitate. He simply took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers, and led her out of the ballroom. The moment they stepped into the sleek black limousine waiting outside, the tension between them snapped. Damien barely gave the driver an address before pulling Alaya onto his lap, capturing her lips in a deep, searing kiss. She gasped against his mouth, her fingers tangling in his perfectly styled hair as he gripped her waist, pulling her closer. "You have no idea how long I've wanted to do that," he growled against her lips. Alaya shivered, arching into him as his hands slid up her sides, his touch setting fire to her skin. By the time they reached his penthouse, their clothes were half undone, their breath ragged. Damien pushed her against the elevator wall, his lips tracing the curve of her neck, making her whimper. She had never wanted someone like this, and it terrified her. The door barely closed before Damien lifted her into his arms, carrying her to his massive bedroom. The city lights spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a soft glow over their tangled bodies as they fell onto the bed. Everything about him was overwhelming. The way he touched her, the way he kissed her, the way he made her feel. She had expected passion. She hadn't expected this. The way he whispered her name like a prayer, the way he slowed down, savoring every inch of her like she was something precious, like she wasn't just another woman to him. Alaya woke to the scent of coffee and the softest sheets she had ever felt against her skin. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she felt the warmth beside her. Damien was still there, lying on his side, shirtless, watching her with a lazy smirk. "Morning, beautiful." Alaya swallowed hard. This was dangerous. This wasn't part of the deal. She had agreed to one night, and one night only. So why did she feel like walking away would be the hardest thing she had ever done? The city lights sparkled like scattered diamonds beyond the massive windows of Damien Knight's penthouse suite. The New York skyline stretched endlessly, but inside these four walls, there was only them. Alaya stood in the middle of the dimly lit room, her heart hammering in her chest as Damien closed the distance between them. The air between them was electric, thick with anticipation. She had made the deal. One night. No strings. But as she looked up into those piercing blue eyes, something inside her whispered that this was no ordinary night. This wasn't just lust. This was a storm waiting to consume them both. Damien's fingers brushed over her bare shoulder, sending a shiver down her spine. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if memorizing every inch of her. His voice was husky, rich with restrained hunger. "You're exquisite, Alaya." She swallowed hard, her breath catching as his lips hovered just above hers. His scent, clean, masculine, intoxicating, wrapped around her, making her dizzy. "Are you always this smooth?" she teased, trying to keep her composure. His lips quirked into a sinful smirk. "Only when I'm this desperate." The confession sent heat pooling deep in her belly. Before she could respond, his mouth finally met hers, and it wasn't just a kiss. It was an unraveling. His lips were soft yet demanding, coaxing her into surrender. His hands slid around her waist, pulling her flush against him. Alaya gasped at the feel of his hard, sculpted body pressing against hers, and that sound seemed to break something inside him. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he deepened the kiss, his tongue sweeping into her mouth, tasting her, claiming her. Alaya clung to him, her fingers tangling in his thick dark hair as he backed her toward the bed. Every touch, every kiss set her skin ablaze, making her forget everything but him. The moment they reached the bed, Damien paused. His hands moved with agonizing slowness as he traced the curve of her body, his gaze drinking her in like she was the most precious thing he had ever seen. "You're breathtaking," he murmured, his voice thick with reverence. Alaya's breath hitched as he trailed his lips down the column of her neck, across her collarbone, lower. Every touch sent shockwaves through her, making her tremble beneath him. It wasn't just lust, it was something more, something unspoken but undeniable. He wasn't just taking her, he was worshipping her. They moved together in a rhythm as old as time, their bodies perfectly in sync. Every kiss, every touch, every whispered name. It wasn't enough. Damien wasn't supposed to feel anything beyond pleasure, but as he held Alaya close, pressing soft kisses against her temple, a terrifying realization settled in his chest. This wasn't just another night. He had been with countless women before, but none of them had ever felt like this. None of them had made him want to stay. Hours passed, but neither of them pulled away. They lay tangled in the sheets, Damien's fingers absent-mindedly tracing circles on Alaya's bare back. Alaya should have left. She should have walked away before it was too late. But when Damien tightened his arms around her, like he didn't want to let go, she knew. She wasn't the only one who felt it. This was supposed to be just one night. So why did it feel like the beginning of something neither of them could escape? The soft glow of the early morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains, casting a pale light across the room. Alaya's eyes fluttered open, the memory of the night before still vivid in her mind, lingering like a warm fire. The sheets were tangled around her body, but her heart felt uneasy. The comfort of Damien's embrace was gone, replaced by the cold, empty feeling of the new day. She had promised herself it would be just one night, but the heat of his touch, the way he had worshipped her as if she were the only woman in the world, had made it so much harder to remember the rules she had set for herself. She slipped out of bed carefully, trying not to wake him. His muscular form was sprawled across the bed, the sheets falling in a messy pile at his waist. His breathing was steady, deep, and content. He was still asleep, peaceful, in a way she had never imagined him to be. Alaya's heart clenched. This was the moment, the one where she would leave. She didn't want to feel this vulnerable. She didn't want to get swept up in something she knew she couldn't have. And though the night had felt like a dream, it was still just that, a fleeting, beautiful fantasy. She stood up, her bare feet silently padding across the cold hardwood floor. The walk to the bathroom felt like the longest of her life. Every step was a reminder of the promise she had made. She wasn't the kind of woman to stay in a man's bed after he had used her for one night of passion. She grabbed her clothes from the floor, hastily pulling them on, barely noticing the tenderness in her body as she dressed. When she looked back at the bed, she saw Damien again, his tousled hair, his bare chest rising and falling with every breath. God! He was beautiful. But she couldn't stay. It wasn't just the rules. It wasn't even the fact that she had never felt more alive than she had in his arms. It was the nagging, undeniable truth that if she stayed any longer, she might never leave. She couldn't allow herself to fall for him, not when she knew he would never want anything more than one night. Damien had always been a man who kept his emotions buried under a thick armor. He had his empire, his wealth, his world, his rules. Relationships were complicated, messy, and distracting, and that was exactly why he had promised himself no strings when he had set his eyes on Alaya last night. But now, something felt wrong. As the early morning light bathed the room, Damien's eyes slowly opened and his gaze shifted to the empty side of the bed. His pulse quickened. He sat up, the sheets falling from his chest as he reached out, trying to feel her warmth, but it was gone. He stared at the empty space beside him, his chest tight in an unfamiliar way. His mind raced, and a strange sense of unease settled in his gut. He should have been relieved. This was exactly what he wanted. But instead, he felt something he had never felt before. Disappointment. Alaya was gone. She had kept her promise one night. And in that moment, Damien knew something was breaking inside him. He wasn't supposed to feel anything. He had always prided himself on being untouchable. He didn't let emotions cloud his judgment, and he didn't let people into his world. But last night, with Alaya, it had been different. The fire in her touch, the way she had surrendered to him so completely, so beautifully, it had left a mark on him. He couldn't explain it, but he wanted more. He wanted her. Damien pushed himself off the bed and stood, the room spinning for a moment as he gathered his bearings. Without a second thought, he moved toward the door, determined to find her. If she thought this was over, she was wrong. Alaya stepped into the elevator, pressing the button to the lobby as the doors slid shut. She could feel the heat still lingering on her skin from the night before, the taste of his lips still fresh in her memory. But as the elevator descended, she felt the sting of her own decision. She had to leave. Damien would never be the man she needed. He was the type of man who loved to conquer, to claim, and then to walk away. She couldn't afford to let him claim her heart. The elevator stopped, and the doors opened with a soft chime. Alaya stepped out into the marble lobby, her heart in her throat as she made her way toward the door. She didn't even realize she was holding her breath until she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, her stomach lurching when she saw Damien standing there, his expression intense and unreadable. "Leaving already?" he asked, his voice low, almost hurt. Alaya swallowed, her hands trembling. "I have to go." "No." Damien's voice was firm, his gaze not leaving hers as he walked toward her. He was determined. His jaw was tight, his eyes blazing with something fierce, something that made her stomach flutter. "You're not leaving, Alaya," he said, his words cutting through the air like a command. For a moment, Alaya considered running, but the raw need in Damien's eyes held her in place, making her heart race even faster. "Why?" she whispered, her voice shaky. "You don't want anything more than one night." Damien took a step closer, his chest brushing against hers. The heat between them was palpable, drawing them together like magnets. "That was before," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Now I want more. I want you." The words hit her like a tidal wave. She didn't know what to say, what to do. Everything inside her screamed to resist, to walk away and never look back, but the way he held her, the way his fingers lightly caressed her cheek, made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something monumental. This wasn't supposed to happen. But it already had. The world outside was cold, the city streets illuminated by the artificial glow of streetlights, but in the silence of Damien's black sports car, the air felt suffocating. He hadn't planned on this. Hell, he had told himself to walk away. One night. That was all it was supposed to be. He had promised himself that after last night's mind-blowing encounter, he wouldn't let it mean anything more. But now, as he sat in his car, parked across the street from her workplace, he couldn't help but feel the raw, gnawing emptiness inside him. It was a feeling he couldn't shake. He had made his way through the day like any other. Board meetings, conference calls, business deals, each task an automatic motion in the machinery of his life. But nothing felt right. There was an ache in his chest, a longing that pulled him toward Alaya. And now, here he was, waiting. Damien had never been the type to chase anyone. Women, money, power. He was used to having them all fall into his lap. But with Alaya, it was different. He couldn't explain it. All he knew was that something inside him refused to let go. He had watched her leave this building earlier, her long dark hair swaying in the cool breeze, her hips moving with a grace that made his heart beat erratically. The way she walked, confident yet with an air of vulnerability, drove him crazy. Damien's jaw clenched. What was he doing? He was Damien Knight, the CEO of one of the largest corporations in the world. He didn't wait around for anyone, especially not for a woman who had made it clear she wasn't interested in sticking around. But even with all the logic in his mind, the urgency in his chest told him something else. He wanted to see her. He wanted to feel her presence again. And so he sat there, waiting. 2 hours. It wasn't like him, not at all. He was always in control, always the one to dictate the pace. Yet here he was, like some kind of love-struck fool. A part of him wanted to drive away, to tell himself it was just one night, to move on and never look back. But the other part, the one that had been awakened by Alaya's touch, her eyes, her laugh, refused to let go. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant. "Mr. Knight, the investor meeting has been rescheduled for tomorrow. Are you still available for dinner tonight?" Damien's gaze fell to the message, but he didn't respond. His mind was somewhere else, lost in thoughts of Alaya. Suddenly, a figure appeared outside the window of the building in front of him. His breath caught in his throat as Alaya stepped out of the building, her long coat flowing behind her like a dark cloud. She was leaving. His heart raced. Without thinking, Damien pushed open his car door and stepped out onto the cold pavement. He could see her walking away from the building, her phone in hand, her head down. She didn't even notice him at first, but when she lifted her head, their eyes met, and everything else faded into oblivion. She didn't look surprised to see him. Instead, she stared at him for a long moment, a soft frown tugging at her lips. It was as if she had been expecting him all along. Damien closed the distance between them, his steps slow but purposeful. As he got closer, he saw the way her lips parted slightly, her eyes flickering with emotion, surprise, confusion, maybe even frustration. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice steady, but there was a trace of something uncertain in it. Damien stopped just a few feet away, his gaze never leaving hers. "I didn't expect to see you," he said, his voice raw with the emotion he hadn't meant to let slip. "But here I am." She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "Why?" He took a deep breath, his chest tightening as he realized how vulnerable he had become in this moment. He had never been this open with anyone, never. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice softening. He stopped, unsure of what to say. He wasn't good at this, wasn't good at sharing his feelings. But with Alaya, it was different. Alaya shifted on her feet, the tension in her shoulders telling him she was holding something back. She finally spoke, her voice quieter now. "You told me it was just one night, Damien. And I agreed." "I know," he replied, his tone more firm now. "But what if one night wasn't enough?" Alaya looked at him, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything they were both too scared to admit. Finally, Alaya took a step back, her arms folding across her chest. "I don't want to play games, Damien." "Neither do I," he said quickly, his heart racing. He stopped himself, trying to collect his thoughts. "I don't want this to be just one night. I want to see you again. I want to spend more time with you." Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second, but then she turned away, her shoulders stiff again. "You don't know what you're saying." "No," he replied, stepping closer, his voice low and intense. "I know exactly what I'm saying." She hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder at him. Their eyes met again, and for a brief moment, the world around them disappeared. The noise of the street, the cold of the night, even the distance between them, it all melted away. Alaya's heart raced, her breath coming faster. Could she really do this? Could she allow herself to fall for a man who had already made it clear he wasn't interested in a real relationship? But there was something in his eyes, something she couldn't deny. He wanted her. Damien took another step forward, the space between them disappearing entirely. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers in a gentle touch. "I don't know what this is, Alaya," he whispered, "but I know I don't want it to end." She looked down at their hands, a tremor running through her as she allowed herself to meet his gaze again. Maybe they were both afraid. But maybe, just maybe, they could figure this out together. Alaya's laughter echoed through the small cafe as she stood outside with her co-worker, wiping the last of the day's exhaustion off her face. It had been an ordinary, busy afternoon. Cups clinking, conversations flowing, the hum of the espresso machine in the background. As much as she loved her job, it was just another step toward her dream of becoming a successful artist. Her heart didn't beat faster for the cappuccino she made or the jokes she exchanged with customers. But that day, as the door swung open and she stepped outside, her eyes landed on him, Damien. He was standing across the street, leaning casually against a black luxury car, his dark, expensive suit clinging to his tall frame in a way that made the world around him seem to slow. His posture was relaxed, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze, like he was waiting. No, he was watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to be affected by him anymore. She had made up her mind after that night. They had their moment, and she was walking away. No strings. But there he was, looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered. The billionaire CEO, the one man she had no business being with, was standing across the street, waiting. Her co-worker noticed the direction of her gaze and smiled knowingly. "Oh, looks like he's back." Alaya's stomach tightened at the realization. He hadn't just disappeared after their brief encounter. Damien had been waiting for her. He hadn't given up. As Alaya's heart thundered in her chest, she tried to act nonchalantly. She waved at her co-worker, then excused herself with a soft smile, her legs moving automatically toward him. She didn't know why she was walking over to him. She should have stayed away. He wasn't the type of man who would stay. He was powerful, used to getting what he wanted. And what he wanted wasn't her. But the magnetic pull between them was undeniable. Damien didn't move when she approached, still watching her with that intense gaze. There was a moment of silence as their eyes locked, and in that instant it felt like the world had stopped. She couldn't look away. "Damien," she breathed, her voice unexpectedly quiet. The simple act of saying his name made her feel like everything she had been running from was suddenly right in front of her. He didn't smile, not immediately, but there was a softness in his eyes as they trailed over her. His lips parted slightly, and he took a step toward her, closing the distance between them without saying a word. She was burning with uncertainty, but so was he. "What are you doing here?" she finally asked, trying to sound composed, but the tremble in her voice betrayed her. "I came to see you," he said softly, his voice low and inviting. Alaya blinked, the weight of his words settling on her. "You came to see me?" She couldn't help but repeat the words, as if she didn't believe them. He didn't want anything more than a night with her. Hadn't he made that clear? "Yes," he replied, the look in his eyes never wavering. "I couldn't stop thinking about you, Alaya." Alaya's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them with such raw honesty. It was as if he wasn't holding anything back, as though he was letting the cracks in his usually impenetrable armor show. It was something she wasn't used to. She felt exposed, vulnerable in his gaze. For a moment, all she could do was stare at him. Damien Knight, untouchable, ruthless, feared, was standing before her, bare in a way that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. Alaya took a deep breath, trying to gather herself, trying to remember why she had pushed him away in the first place. He was a billionaire, used to controlling everything around him. He was the type of man who had 1,000,000 women throwing themselves at him, so why did he want her? But then, as if sensing her hesitation, Damien took a step closer, his voice softer. "I told myself I would move on," he confessed, his hand reaching out, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm. "But I can't. Not when I'm like this. When I'm—" He paused, searching her eyes for understanding. "When I'm falling for you." His words hit her like a thunderstorm, knocking all her carefully constructed walls down. Falling for her? She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. She didn't know how to respond. Damien seemed to sense her uncertainty and let out a breath. "I know it's complicated, but I don't care, Alaya. I want to see where this can go, and I'm not going to just let you walk away." His hand slid from her arm to her hand, gently cupping it in his thumb brushing over her knuckles. The tenderness in his touch made her heart ache. "I don't want to run anymore," he whispered. "I want to be with you." Alaya's mind raced. The walls she had worked so hard to build around herself crumbled at his words, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel the weight of the connection between them. He wasn't just saying these things because he was trying to win her over. He wasn't playing a game. Damien Knight was falling for her. And as that truth settled in, her own heart began to pound. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to come after her. But here he was, standing before her, waiting. "You don't know what you're saying," she finally whispered, unsure if she was saying it to him or to herself. "I do." He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "I've never been more certain about anything in my life." And with that, his lips were on hers, gently at first, as if testing the waters. But soon the kiss deepened, and Alaya felt every ounce of longing, every unspoken promise, echo in that single, electric moment. As their lips parted, their foreheads leaned against each other, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't want to pull away. She didn't want to fight this connection. Alaya closed her eyes, letting the moment wash over her. Could she really do this? Could she let him in? "I want you," Damien murmured against her lips, his voice filled with emotion. And in that moment, all of her doubts, all of her fears, melted away. Maybe they were both scared, but there was something undeniable between them, something that couldn't be ignored. And this time, she didn't want to walk away. Alaya stood in front of Damien, arms crossed, her expression hard as steel. The moment they had shared just moments ago felt like a dream, something she might wake up from at any second. But this wasn't a dream. This was real. And in that moment, the weight of everything between them pressed down on her, making it impossible to breathe. "Why are you here, Damien?" she asked, her voice stronger than she felt. Her heart pounded in her chest as she met his gaze, unwilling to look away, even though everything inside her screamed to run. Damien, as usual, exuded an air of control, but there was a subtle tension in his jaw, a wariness in his eyes that made her breath catch. He smirked, the cocky expression he always wore now laced with something darker, something more vulnerable. "I don't know," he said, but his eyes gave him away. His words didn't match the intensity in his gaze. She could see it, the raw longing behind his facade, the desperate need he wasn't ready to acknowledge, not even to himself. Alaya's heart wrenched, but she refused to let him see it. He wasn't supposed to be here. That was the first rule she had set for herself. It was supposed to be a one-time thing, no strings attached. That was how she protected herself, kept her heart out of the equation. But every time she looked at him, every time he was near, that rule began to unravel. And the terrifying thing was, she didn't know if she could stop it. "I don't believe you," she said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. She wasn't angry, not really, she was just confused, torn. Damien didn't respond right away, the smile fading slightly as he watched her. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something close to regret, but it was gone before she could fully recognize it. He took a step closer, and even though she wanted to pull away, something inside her urged her to stay still. His voice was quieter now, the teasing edge gone. "I know it's complicated, Alaya," he said, his tone softer, almost hesitant. "But I didn't come here to hurt you. I came because—" He paused, searching her face for something, like he was trying to read her thoughts. "Because I don't want to lose you." Alaya's heart did a little flip at his words, but she quickly shut it down. She couldn't let herself be swayed by him again. He was Damien Knight, the man who had everything at his feet, the man who could have anyone he wanted. She was just a woman who served him a drink at a bar. He wasn't looking for more. He couldn't be. But he was here, and he was standing in front of her like he meant it, like he wanted something from her that wasn't just a night of passion. Alaya swallowed the lump in her throat. "No," she said firmly, pushing him back a step. "You don't get to do this, Damien. You don't get to come here after everything we talked about and say that you want more." Her voice shook, despite the strength in her words. She hated how he made her feel, how vulnerable she was when he was near. She hated the way his presence rattled her, the way she couldn't think clearly. "You said it yourself. It was just one night." She was repeating the words he had spoken to her so many times before, but now they felt like a lie. She had told herself it was just one night, but deep down she knew it was more than that. The pull between them was undeniable, and the more she tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. Damien's eyes darkened, a flicker of frustration crossing his features. "You really want to pretend like last night didn't mean anything?" he asked, his voice low, laced with an edge she hadn't heard before. His usual confidence was replaced by something raw, something desperate. "No, I'm not pretending," Alaya replied, her voice trembling now. "But I'm not falling for you, Damien. You have everything, money, power, control. What could someone like me offer you?" Her words were a defense mechanism, a shield to protect herself from the vulnerability that threatened to consume her. She needed to remind herself of who they were. She was a girl from the streets, barely getting by. He was a billionaire, a man who could have anyone. This was just a fleeting thing for him, something he could throw away once the novelty wore off. She couldn't let herself believe otherwise. Damien stepped forward again, his gaze steady and unrelenting. "What could you offer me?" he repeated, his voice hardening slightly, though the passion in his eyes remained. "You're more than you realize, Alaya. You make me feel things I don't even understand." Alaya shook her head, trying to fight back the intense emotion that threatened to swallow her whole. "You're confused, Damien. Whatever this is, it's not real. You don't even know me." He took a step forward, his face inches from hers. His hand reached up, cupping her cheek gently as he stared into her eyes with a softness that made her heart ache. "I know enough to know that I want to be with you," he said softly, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "And if you're being honest with yourself, you know it too." Her chest tightened as the truth hit her, like a wave crashing over her. Her head screamed at her to walk away, to stop this before it went too far. But her heart was telling her something else entirely. He wasn't just a billionaire CEO. He was Damien. The man who made her laugh, the man who had shared something with her that no one else ever had. The man who made her feel seen, not just like a face in the crowd. and just as she thought she might let herself fall, she pushed him away. "I can't do this," Alaya whispered, stepping back, putting distance between them. "I won't be the one to get hurt." Damien watched her, his face unreadable. "You're scared, Alaya, and I get it. But don't lie to yourself. You want this too." "I don't." Her words felt hollow. She could lie to him, but she couldn't lie to herself. Alaya's heart pounded in her chest as she turned away from him, her steps quick and deliberate as she walked toward the door. She wanted to escape, to leave behind everything that was threatening to drown her in emotions she wasn't prepared for. But before she could step inside, she felt his hand gently grasp her wrist, pulling her back to him. "Damien," she breathed, her voice breaking, the weight of everything between them sinking in. He didn't speak. Instead, he pulled her into him, his lips crashing onto hers in a kiss that was full of desperation, full of longing. A kiss that spoke, the words neither of them could say aloud. And for a moment, everything else faded away. Damien Knight was a man who wasn't used to being told no. He didn't tolerate rejection, especially when it came to something or someone he desired. And right now, there was one thing on his mind. Alaya Carter. Over the past few weeks, Damien had done the one thing he knew best, pursue her relentlessly. He wasn't a stranger to taking what he wanted, but with Alaya, it was different. She wasn't like the women he usually dated. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or status. She wasn't throwing herself at him like the others. And that intrigued him more than anything. He had tried to move on, to let her go after she had pushed him away. But it was impossible. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and every day without her felt like a battle he was losing. The empty nights were the hardest, his mind racing with thoughts of her, his body aching for the warmth of her touch. Damien wasn't one to wait for things to happen, and he wasn't going to let this connection slip through his fingers. He had made up his mind. He was going to win her heart. Damien knew Alaya was an artist, but he had never seen her work. She had told him about her passion, about how she dreamed of one day having her own gallery, but he hadn't truly understood the depth of it until he walked into her first gallery exhibition. He had made sure to arrive early, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. People murmured as they noticed the billionaire CEO strolling through the entrance. But Damien wasn't there for them. He wasn't there to show off his wealth. He was there for Alaya. His eyes scanned the room, and then they found her. She was standing near the far end of the gallery, dressed in an elegant, simple black dress, her smile radiating warmth as she spoke with a group of patrons. She looked breathtaking, more beautiful than he had ever remembered. Her confidence and grace had only grown since their first meeting, and it made him ache with desire. He couldn't resist. He walked over to her, and the moment her gaze landed on him, something shifted. The air between them thickened. "Damien," she said softly, her voice filled with a mix of surprise and wariness. Her eyes flickered, not with the excitement he had hoped for, but with caution. She had every right to be guarded, but that only made him more determined to break through. "Your work is incredible," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I'll take them all." Alaya stared at him, her eyes narrowing as if trying to read him. "You're serious?" she asked, disbelief lacing her tone. "Every single piece," he confirmed, his voice unwavering. He wanted to show her that he was here for more than just a passing interest. She hesitated, a mixture of emotions flashing across her face before she nodded. She knew it wasn't just about the paintings, it was about him making his mark in her world, about him continuing to pursue her in ways she couldn't ignore. As he walked around, choosing every painting, he didn't just buy her art. He bought pieces of her heart, inch by inch. The more he paid for, the more he pulled her into his orbit. Alaya tried to tell herself she didn't care. that Damien's gestures didn't mean anything, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't deny the effect he had on her. A week later, a delivery of roses arrived at her apartment. Long, delicate stems with petals so soft and white, they looked like something out of a dream. She picked up the note attached, her fingers trembling as she read, "You haunt me, Alaya." The words were simple, but they hit her like a bolt of lightning. There was something so raw in his message, so vulnerable. She could feel the sincerity behind it, the unspoken plea for her to let him in. But she wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. Still, it was impossible to ignore the pull. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face. Every time she tried to go about her day, his voice echoed in her mind. Despite her attempts to keep her distance, his roses kept arriving, delicate arrangements that showed up without warning, each note just a little more daring than the last. They were never long, just short, honest lines that tugged at her heart. "I'm not giving up. I think about you every night. I want you, Alaya." And each note felt like a confession, every bouquet he sent, a promise. Alaya had tried her best to avoid him, to not be swayed by his efforts. But it was impossible. Every time she turned him away, it felt like she was lying to herself. Every time she saw his name on the roses or heard his voice in a note, the walls around her heart came crumbling down a little more. And then, one fateful evening, after another long day of ignoring him and burying her emotions, she walked out of her building, only to find him standing there, waiting for her. Her breath caught as her gaze met his, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I'm not going anywhere, Alaya," Damien said softly, his voice filled with an undeniable longing. She swallowed hard, her heart racing. She had tried to shut him out, but he was right there in front of her, and then, before she could even think, he was kissing her. It was slow at first, tentative, almost like he was testing her response, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she kissed him back, her lips parting slightly as she allowed herself to feel the heat between them. It was different this time. There was no pretense, no hesitation. Their kiss was fierce, desperate. She could feel the weight of his desire, his emotions crashing into her, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. The barriers she had so carefully built up came crumbling down, piece by piece, until all that was left was the undeniable connection between them. Her fingers tangled in his hair as she pulled him closer, feeling the heat of his body against hers. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All she could do was kiss him back, fully and completely, surrendering to the inevitable. When they finally pulled away, breathless, Damien's forehead pressed against hers. "I told you, Alaya," he whispered, "I'm not going to stop until you're mine." And in that moment, as she looked into his eyes, she realized that she didn't want him to stop. Alaya had fought it. She had tried to convince herself that he was just another billionaire, another man who would eventually walk away when the thrill wore off. But now, with his lips still warm against hers and his hands holding her close, she couldn't deny the truth. She wasn't just fighting him, she was fighting herself. And the harder she fought, the more she knew she would lose. It had started as a game, a challenge for Damien Knight, a billionaire CEO who had everything at his disposal except the one thing he hadn't bargained for: Alaya Carter. From the moment their paths crossed at that exclusive gala, his desire for her was undeniable. She had been different, untouched by his wealth, untouched by his status. She was raw, real, and fierce. The more he tried to win her over, the deeper he fell. But what started as a reckless pursuit had evolved into something Damien couldn't control, something that frightened him in ways he never expected. For the first time in his life, he felt vulnerable. And that vulnerability was a sensation he was unprepared for. Alaya had infiltrated his life in ways he hadn't imagined. It wasn't just her beauty that consumed him, though that certainly helped. It was the way she challenged him, the way she made him feel things he thought he had buried long ago. His mind was filled with her, his body craved her, and every moment away from her was pure torture. She wasn't just a passing fascination, she was his obsession, and as much as he hated to admit it, he was falling for her. For weeks they had been entangled in a dance of passion, but it had been more than that. With each kiss, each stolen moment together, they had built something powerful, something undeniable. There was no denying the way his heart raced when she was near, the way her touch made his skin burn. But love, he realized, wasn't just about desire. It wasn't just about the moments of heat and passion. Love was vulnerability. It was the fear of losing someone who had become a part of you, a fear of exposing every fragile part of your soul. Damien had never been afraid of anything, not until Aliyah. She had cracked open the walls he had built around his heart, and he didn't know how to put them back together. At first, it had been easy to keep things casual. A one-night stand, no strings attached, just a brief escape from the chaos of his life. But now, it was different. They weren't just two bodies craving each other. They were two souls connecting in a way Damien couldn't explain. He found himself thinking about her when he woke up, when he went to bed, even in the midst of meetings with billion-dollar clients. His thoughts drifted to her smile, the way her laugh made him forget everything, the way her hazel eyes softened when she looked at him. For the first time, he wanted more. He wanted to build something with her, something lasting. But how could he? He had always kept people at arm's length. And here he was, wanting to tear down every boundary he had ever created. Aliyah, for her part, was equally caught in the whirlwind of emotions. The first time they had kissed, she had known it would change everything. She had never allowed herself to get close to someone like this, so intensely, so openly. But with Damien, it felt different. When he touched her, it wasn't just about the chemistry, the fire. It was about feeling seen, feeling understood in a way no one else ever had. He made her feel alive in ways she couldn't explain. His gaze, his touch, the way he made her feel like the only woman in the world. It was intoxicating. But love, too, came with its own set of complications. Aliyah had always been independent, fiercely protective of her heart. She had grown up on her own, without the luxury of relying on anyone. She had learned early on that people came and went, and nothing, no one, lasted forever. Damien's persistent pursuit of her had shaken her resolve. She told herself it was just the attraction, just the chemistry, but deep down, she knew it was more. She was falling for him, and she had no idea how to stop it. She was afraid of being hurt, afraid of the vulnerability that came with opening her heart. But with Damien, it was different. Her heart called to his, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she couldn't escape the pull. One evening, as they sat together in his penthouse, silent, the air thick with unspoken words, Damien broke the silence. "I'm scared, Aliyah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Scared of what?" Damien ran a hand through his dark hair, his eyes haunted. "Of this, of you, of us." Aliyah's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified that he was feeling the same things. She took a step closer to him, reaching out, her hand resting on his. "Damien," she whispered, "we don't have to be scared. We don't have to rush. We'll figure this out." But even as she spoke the words, she wasn't sure she meant them. Was she ready to let go of the control she had always kept so tightly gripped? Was she ready to take that leap, to let him see all of her, the parts of her she had kept hidden? Damien's eyes locked onto hers, his gaze filled with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. "I don't know how to love, Aliyah. I've never had to love anyone. I've always controlled everything in my life. And now I can't control how I feel about you." His confession broke her heart in ways she hadn't expected. He had always been so confident, so sure of himself. To see him vulnerable, exposed, it was a side of him she hadn't seen before. It made her want to reach for him, to pull him into her arms and make him believe that this was worth fighting for, but she was just as scared as he was. In that moment of raw honesty, Aliyah leaned forward, capturing his lips in a soft, tentative kiss. It was a kiss full of uncertainty, full of questions. It wasn't the passionate, fiery kiss of before. It was something more, something deeper. It was a promise and a plea. A promise that no matter how scared they both were, they would face the unknown together. A plea that maybe, just maybe, love could overcome their fears. Damien responded immediately, his lips moving against hers with a hunger that surprised them both. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer, as if he needed to feel her against him to remind himself that this wasn't just a dream. When they broke apart, their breaths coming in shallow bursts, Damien rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know if I'm ready for this, Aliyah," he murmured. "But I know I'm ready for you." And in that moment, the walls between them began to crumble, piece by piece. The love they had tried to deny was undeniable now, and no matter how hard they fought it, they were bound together by something stronger than fear. As the night unfolded, Aliyah and Damien found themselves standing at a crossroads. They had each been running from their own fears, their own insecurities, but now, in each other's arms, they knew there was no turning back. Damien wasn't just the billionaire CEO who could get anything he wanted. He was a man who had been forced to confront the deepest parts of himself. And Aliyah wasn't just the woman he had fallen for. She was the woman who would make him believe in something beyond control. With every kiss, every touch, every whispered promise, they were building something that could not be denied. Their love, terrifying as it was, had begun. And they would face whatever came next, together. Everything had seemed perfect. After weeks of passion, of connecting in ways that neither Damien nor Aliyah had ever experienced, they were finally living in a world where their love felt real. Every moment spent together was a treasure. Shared glances, quiet dinners, intimate late-night talks. The barriers between them had melted, leaving only raw honesty, tenderness, and longing. It was the kind of love that was both exciting and terrifying. Damien had finally opened up to her. His vulnerabilities were no longer hidden behind the facade of his wealth and control. He allowed Aliyah to see him, truly see him, in a way that no one else ever had. And she, in turn, had started to trust him, to let him into her world, the one she had always kept protected. For a while, they existed in their own bubble of love, the outside world unable to touch them. But like all things, the bubble eventually burst. It started with the first whisper, a picture of them leaving Damien's penthouse, a rare sight since Damien had always been meticulous about keeping his personal life out of the public eye. The image was snapped from a distance, blurry, but revealing enough to spark the curiosity of tabloids and gossip columns. The whispers quickly became louder. The next day, the headlines came. Billionaire CEO's secret romance with unknown artist. Damien Knight's new woman, a gold digger looking for a payday. Is Aliyah Carter after Damien Knight's fortune? Aliyah stared at her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through the articles. The words cut into her like 1,000 tiny shards of glass. Gold digger, scheming, out for his money. The words they used to describe her twisted and dehumanized her, painting her as nothing more than a trophy for a billionaire to flaunt. She had never cared about fame or wealth. All she had ever wanted was to be seen as her own person, not a reflection of Damien's success. Yet here they were, her name plastered across every tabloid, her worth reduced to the man beside her, to the very thing that made her feel so alive. Tears filled her eyes as she read the accusations. The harsh, unrelenting words cut deeper than she had imagined. She wasn't just hurt for herself, she was hurt for the man she loved, knowing this would put a target on him, that his carefully curated image, his empire, would now be threatened by the very love they had built. She couldn't be the reason Damien lost everything. She wouldn't let herself be the cause of his downfall. Damien had always been prepared for the challenges that came with wealth, but this was different. He had never felt so helpless. His empire, his entire life, was built on control. His public image, his reputation, his business relationships, all of it depended on maintaining the illusion of perfection. To let anyone in, to let Alaya in, meant dismantling the walls he had spent years constructing. And now, everything was crumbling around him. He had tried to protect her, to keep their love away from the media frenzy, but the paparazzi had found them, and the world was watching. Alaya didn't deserve this, didn't deserve the cruel words, the harsh judgment. She had done nothing wrong, but she was now facing the consequences of being with him, and it was more than either of them had bargained for. Damien knew what needed to be done. The thought tore at his heart, but there was no other way. He had to choose between her and the life he had built. And though he knew it was impossible to keep her and protect her from the world, part of him wanted to fight, to prove that love could overcome everything. But another part of him, the part that had controlled every aspect of his life, knew that this was a battle he couldn't win without sacrificing something too precious. It was that night, in the quiet of his penthouse, when he stood in front of Alaya, looking into her eyes, that he made the hardest decision of his life. She had been avoiding him all day, her phone constantly buzzing with messages from friends and family, but nothing had prepared her for the crushing weight of what Damien was about to say. She had tried to block it out, tried to ignore the truth of what the media was saying, but it was clear now. There was no escaping it. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Damien, why are you doing this? Why are you letting them tear us apart?" Damien ran a hand through his hair, his face contorted in anguish. He stepped closer to her, but there was a distance between them that neither of them could bridge. "I never wanted this for you, Alaya," he said, his voice hoarse with pain. "I never wanted you to have to face this. The media, the rumors, the hate. It's too much. I can't protect you from it. I can't protect us from it." His voice cracked as he spoke, the weight of his words breaking his heart in pieces. Alaya's eyes filled with tears as she reached out for him. "I don't care what they say. I love you, Damien, and that's all that matters." But her words, though full of love, only seemed to deepen the pain in his chest. He loved her more than he could express, more than she would ever know. But his love for her was precisely why he couldn't let her be dragged through the mud. "No, Alaya," Damien's voice was trembling, filled with a quiet desperation. "You deserve so much more than this. You deserve peace. You deserve a life where you can be free of this circus." He took a step back, his heart breaking as he spoke the words he never thought he would say. "I'm letting you go." The words felt like a punch to her stomach. Alaya couldn't breathe. It was as though the ground had shifted beneath her and she was falling, spiraling into an abyss. "Damien," she whispered, shaking her head, "you can't be serious." But his eyes, full of sorrow, told her that he was. This was the only way he knew how to protect her. It was the only way he could save her from the storm that was about to hit. She shook her head again, refusing to believe it. "You can't do this. You can't just walk away." But Damien was already stepping back, each step further from her heart. "I have to. This is the only way I can keep you safe, Alaya." Tears spilled from her eyes as she reached for him, but it was too late. Damien turned away, his face hardening as he walked out of the door, leaving her standing there, broken and alone. As the door closed behind him, the silence felt deafening. Her body trembled as her heart shattered. The love they had fought for, the love they had shared, it was over. Damien Knight had walked away, and Elia was left to pick up the pieces of her broken heart. The days felt like weeks, and the weeks felt like years. Damien Knight had always been a man who was in control, who could handle anything that came his way. He had built an empire from the ground up, his power and wealth extending into every corner of the world. For years, he had been the master of his own fate, never second-guessing his decisions, never questioning the paths he chose. But now, sitting in his penthouse office, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city, nothing felt right. The city buzzed with activity, the lights from the skyscrapers gleaming like diamonds in the distance, but Damien felt hollow. The noise, the commotion, none of it mattered. He had it all: money, power, influence. Yet he was empty. The walls that had once protected him from vulnerability now felt suffocating. The silence around him was deafening. He had been running at full speed for so long, consumed by his work, by his ambition. But now, all he could think about was a liar. He hadn't expected it to be this way. The decision to let her go had felt necessary at the time, a way to protect her from the cruel judgment of the world. He had thought that once the choice was made, he would feel relief, that he would regain control of his life. But the truth was, he hadn't felt relief at all. He had only felt a gaping hole in his chest, a void that could never be filled by anything, anyone, except her. Her laugh, her smile, the way her hazel eyes sparkled when she was excited about something, her quiet strength, her ability to challenge him, to make him laugh, to make him feel alive. It was all gone now. And the emptiness that had taken its place was suffocating. He had tried to move on. He had thrown himself into his work, buried himself in meetings, in business deals, in the endless cycle of corporate life. He had attended gala events, mingled with other powerful men and women, but it was all just a blur. Nothing mattered. No matter how many zeros were in his bank account, no matter how many accolades he received, none of it made him feel the way she did. None of it gave him the sense of warmth, of purpose that she brought into his life. It wasn't just her beauty, her intelligence, or her fire. It was the way she made him see the world differently, made him feel human. She was the one person who had ever made him forget about his carefully constructed walls, about the life he had built. When he was with her, he was just Damien, not a CEO, not a billionaire, just a man. And now he had nothing but the ghost of her. Her scent lingered in the sheets of his bed, her laughter echoed in his mind, and every corner of his apartment felt empty without her. It happened on a quiet evening, a few weeks after he had let her go. He was sitting at his desk, scrolling through emails, trying to bury himself in work, when a picture popped up on his phone. It was one of the photos they had taken together, a candid shot from their time in the park when they had walked hand in hand, the sun setting in the distance. In the photo, she was smiling, her eyes twinkling with joy, her skin glowing in the soft light. She looked so free, so beautiful, so happy, and as he stared at the image, something inside him snapped. He had been denying it for so long, but now it was clear. The truth had finally hit him like a ton of bricks. He loved her. Elia Carter wasn't just a fling, a passing distraction. She wasn't just some woman he had shared a night of passion with. She was his heart. She was the one who had turned his world upside down, who had made him feel emotions he didn't even know he was capable of. He couldn't live without her. He stood up from his desk, his heart pounding in his chest. The realization was as sharp as it was overwhelming. Why did I let her go? He asked himself. Why didn't I fight for her? His entire life had been about control, about power, about never being vulnerable. But now, all of it seemed meaningless. Nothing in his vast empire could replace the feeling of her touch, the softness of her voice, the spark in her eyes when she spoke about her dreams. He had made a mistake. the biggest mistake of his life. And now, he had to fix it. He couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't let pride or fear control him any longer. He needed to make things right, to tell her everything, to show her that he loved her, that he was ready to do whatever it took to fight for their love. Damien immediately pulled out his phone and began typing a message to his assistant, his fingers moving faster than they ever had before. "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the day. I'm going to find her." He didn't care what it took. He was going to track her down, apologize for the pain he had caused her, and tell her the truth. He loved her, and he would stop at nothing to win her back. He grabbed his coat and stormed out of his office, his heart racing with anticipation. He had always been a man of action, and now, more than ever, he was going to prove it. Damien's mind raced as he made his way through the city. Every moment that passed felt like an eternity. He needed to find her. He needed to tell her what she meant to him, to show her that he wasn't just some CEO with a well-guarded heart. He was a man who had learned the hard way that love was worth fighting for. He went to the cafe she had worked at before, but there was no sign of her. The gallery where she showcased her art was empty as well. He began to panic, his thoughts spinning, but then, as if fate had intervened, he spotted her. A flash of brown skin, her elegant frame standing at the edge of a nearby park. She was sitting on a bench, looking up at the sky, her expression thoughtful, almost serene. The moment he saw her, his heart leapt into his throat. She was everything to him, everything he had ever wanted and more. He walked toward her slowly, his breath catching in his throat. He stopped just behind her, not daring to speak at first. He couldn't. He needed this moment to sink in, to feel the weight of it all. Aliyah turned, and their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to fade away. There was only him, and there was only her. And in that instant, Damien realized that there was nothing in this world worth more than the love they shared. He stepped forward, his heart in his throat, and as if drawn by some magnetic force, he took her hand in his, holding it gently but firmly. "Aliyah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you. I'm sorry for everything. Please don't walk away from me again. I can't live without you." The look in her eyes softened, and for the first time since he had let her go, Damien knew that everything was going to be okay. In that moment, Aliyah smiled through her tears. "I love you too, Damien," she whispered back. And with that, all the pain, all the fear, all the heartbreak, they were forgotten. What mattered was the truth they had both discovered in each other. Their love was real, and this time, nothing, not even the world, could tear them apart. It had been weeks since they had come to terms with their feelings, weeks since Damien had confessed his love to Aliyah under the soft glow of the park's lights, weeks since they had both let go of the past and embraced a future together. Or so they thought. But fate, in all its mischievousness, had other plans. It was a cold, rainy night in New York City, the kind of rain that soaked through every layer of clothing and left you shivering to the bone. The streets were slick with water, and the city lights reflected off the pavement in a blurry dance of colors. Aliyah was in her art gallery, closing for the night. The quiet hum of the lights flickered above her as she gathered her things, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. It had been a long one, filled with gallery openings, meetings with potential buyers, and the constant nagging thoughts of her future as an artist. Despite the joy she had found in her work, there was still a quiet emptiness. The emptiness was him, Damien, the man who had come into her life like a storm, changing everything she thought she knew about love, about herself, about what it meant to truly open your heart. She hadn't seen him in days. He had been busy, caught up in his work, in his world of billion-dollar decisions, meetings, and constant pressure. But every night, Alaya found herself missing him more and more, wondering when they would finally make time for each other again. As she locked the front door of the gallery, she glanced out the large windows and froze. There, standing in the rain, drenched and soaked to the bone, was Damien. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to see him tonight, hadn't expected him to come at all. His suit, once perfectly tailored, was now clinging to his body, water dripping down from his hair and the edges of his jacket. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the way he stood there, eyes locked on hers, a look of determination and regret written all over his face. Alaya didn't know what to say, didn't know if she should open the door, or if she was even ready to face him after everything that had happened. The emotions that swirled within her were like a whirlwind, pulling her in different directions. But before she could make a decision, Damien began walking toward her, his strides purposeful and unwavering despite the storm that raged around him. As he stepped inside, shaking off the rain and his drenched coat, he looked up at her with raw emotion in his eyes that told a story of regret, longing and realization. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with the weight of everything he had been carrying. "I thought I could live without you. I thought I could handle this without you." His words hit Alaya like a tidal wave, washing away every doubt, every fear, every wall she had built up to protect her heart. She had loved him so much, had fought for him even when he had let her go. And now, here he was, standing in front of her, vulnerable and real, admitting that he needed her as much as she needed him. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered his name, her heart pounding in her chest. "Damien!" Damien reached for her, his hands trembling slightly as he cupped her face, brushing the wet strands of hair away from her forehead. The rain continued to pour down outside, but the world around them seemed to stand still. The only thing that mattered was them. "I don't want just one night," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want every night, every morning, every moment, with you." His gaze was intense, focused on her, as if she was the only thing in the world that mattered. "You've been the best part of my life, Alaya. I can't keep living without you. I won't let you go again." The words he spoke were everything she had been waiting to hear, everything she had longed for in the silence of her nights. She had always known that Damien was the one for her, but it had taken him so long to realize the truth. And now that he had, she wasn't going to let anything, nothing, get in the way of their love. Without another word, Alaya closed the distance between them, throwing her arms around his neck, pulling him closer as if she could melt into him. The kiss they shared was nothing short of magical. It wasn't just passion. It wasn't just desire. It was everything they had been through together, the heartache, the longing, the moments of doubt, and now, finally, the love that had always been there. As their lips met, Alaya's heart soared. She kissed him with everything she had, every bit of emotion that had been bottled up for weeks, months. It was a kiss that said everything she had wanted to say, everything she had wanted to feel. She kissed him as if she was giving him all of her, trusting him completely, knowing this time it wasn't just about the passion or the physical connection. It was about love, true, undeniable love. Damien deepened the kiss, his hands cradling her face as if he was afraid to let her go. The rain continued to pour around them, but they were oblivious to it now, lost in each other. "I love you," Damien whispered against her lips, his voice breaking with emotion. "I love you, Alaya. I never want to leave you again." Alaya smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with happiness. She had never been more sure of anything in her life. "I love you too," she whispered back, "and I'll never let you go, Damien. Not ever again." As they held each other, their lips meeting again in a kiss that sealed their future, they both knew that their journey together was just beginning. There would be no more walls, no more doubts, no more letting go. From this moment on, they were united, two souls bound together by love. And this time, they weren't letting each other go.